The frontier was a place where only the ruthless thrived. A vast, untamed land where justice was a fleeting concept, and the weak were trampled beneath the boots of outlaws. Towns were few and far between, and those that did exist were controlled by men who had carved their names into history with blood and bullets. Beyond the last shreds of civilization lay the Callahan Ranch, a modest spread of land on the outskirts of a lawless town. It was a place where honest work still mattered, but survival came at a steep price. Dust swirled in the dry air, carried by the whispering wind that rustled through brittle grass. The creak of a saloon door in the distant town echoed through the empty night, followed by the occasional crack of gunfire, a reminder that even the lawmen weren't immune to the chaos of the West. Despite the danger that lurked in every shadow, Samuel and Evelyn Callahan had carved out a life here, determined to make something of their land. But peace was an illusion, and the world had a way of pulling people back into the life they tried to leave behind. To the untrained eye, Evelyn Callahan was nothing more than a rancher's wife. Quiet, reserved, content to tend to her home. But appearances could be deceiving. In her late 30s, Eve was a woman of striking presence, her sharp green eyes carrying the weight of a past few dared to question. She moved with a quiet grace, her every motion precise, controlled. Beneath her calm exterior lay a history that only a handful of people truly knew. Once, she had been known by another name. Beyond the last shreds of civilization lay the Callahan Ranch, a modest spread of land on the outskirts of a lawless town where the concept of justice had long been abandoned. It was a place where honest work still mattered, where men and women toiled under the relentless sun, but where survival often came at a steep price. Dust swirled in the dry air, carried by the whispering wind that rustled through brittle grass. The lowing of cattle and the distant howl of a lone coyote were the only sounds that broke the silence of the plains. Beyond the horizon, nestled in the filth and lawlessness, the town of Black Hollow festered like an open wound. At night, the wind carried the creak of the saloon door, followed by drunken shouting, the occasional bark of laughter, and, more often than not, the sharp crack of gunfire. No one in Black Hollow flinched at the sound anymore. Outlaws, bounty hunters, and desperate men made up most of the town's population. Even the so-called lawmen were just another breed of predator, picking and choosing which crimes to ignore, which bribes to take, and which bodies to bury. But despite the danger that lurked in every shadow, Samuel and Evelyn Callahan had carved out a life on the outskirts, determined to make something of their land. For Samuel, the ranch was a dream, a future built with his own hands, far away from the corruption of the town. He worked tirelessly, rising with the sun and falling into bed well past sundown, his hands rough and calloused from years of hard labor. For Evelyn, however, the ranch was a sanctuary from a past she longed to leave behind. To the untrained eye, Evelyn Callahan was nothing more than a rancher's wife, quiet, reserved, and content to tend to the home while her husband managed the cattle. She played the role well, keeping to herself, moving through town with a polite but distant air. But appearances could be deceiving. At 39, Eve was a woman of striking presence, tall, lean, with sharp green eyes that carried the weight of experience few dared to question. She moved with a quiet grace, her every motion precise, controlled. She never wasted an ounce of energy, never made a careless move. Even the way she carried herself, straight-backed, calm, set her apart. Most of the town assumed she was simply a woman hardened by frontier life, but those with a sharper eye could sense something else. An edge. A subtle tension in the way she watched people, measured them. Because beneath her calm exterior lay a history that only a handful of people truly knew. Once, she had been known by another name. A name whispered in fear. A legend spoken in hushed tones by outlaws who had seen what she could do, or by those who had barely escaped her. A ghost of the West. A gunslinger whose aim was unerring, whose wrath was merciless. But Eve had left that life behind. Or at least, she had tried. She had sworn never to pick up a gun again, to bury the past beneath the soil of her new life. But peace was an illusion in a land ruled by men with no conscience. And when trouble came knocking, she knew one thing for certain. The Widowmaker was not gone. She was only waiting. A legend whispered in saloons and around campfires. Eve had once been the most feared gunslinger in the West. Her name alone had sent men scrambling for cover. Her reputation built on a steady hand and an unshakable resolve. But those days were behind her. She had left that life to build something real with Samuel, trading her guns for a life of quiet labor and honest love. Yet, the fire inside her had never died, and when the moment came, she would remind the world why she had been feared. Samuel Callahan was a man of unwavering integrity. In a land where cruelty was often rewarded, he had chosen a different path, tall and broad-shouldered. He carried the strength of a man who worked with his hands, his skin rough from years spent under the relentless sun. Samuel knew his wife's past, every dark corner, every whispered rumor, but he had never feared it. He understood why she had left that world behind, and he respected her choice. He worked tirelessly to keep their ranch afloat, refusing to let the looming threats from outlaws dictate their lives. When the Black Vultures came sniffing around, demanding their so-called protection money, Samuel had met them with defiance. He believed that standing his ground was the only way to survive. He didn't realize they had already decided to take something far more valuable from him. There were outlaws, and then there were monsters. The Black Vultures were the latter. Led by Jeb, the Vulture Crowley, they were a gang that thrived on fear. They roamed from town to town, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Extortion, theft, and murder were their calling cards. Jeb himself was a man with no soul to speak of. Lean, with piercing eyes and a jagged scar running down his cheek. He ruled with an iron fist. To him, the Callahan Ranch was just another conquest. He had mistaken Samuel's kindness for weakness, and Eve. He saw her as nothing more than leverage, a way to force Samuel into submission. His mistake would cost him everything. The attack came under the cover of darkness. The Callahan Ranch, quiet and still, was suddenly alive with chaos. The Black Vultures descended like a storm, their horses kicking up dust as they tore through the property. Samuel fought, but he was outnumbered, beaten and left bleeding in the dirt. They took Eve. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Bound and thrown over the back of a horse, she listened as the men laughed, mocking her as nothing more than a rancher's wife. But they had no idea who they had just taken. As they rode into the night, leaving destruction in their wake, Eve remained calm, calculating. She had been in worse situations, and by the time this was over, they would wish they had never laid eyes on her. Samuel Callahan lay in the dirt, blood seeping into the dry earth. His ribs ached with every breath, and his vision swam from the blows he'd taken. But pain was the last thing on his mind. Eve was gone. He forced himself up, staggering toward the house. His hands trembled as he grabbed his rifle from the porch, but deep down, he knew he couldn't do this alone. He was a rancher, not a warrior. Charging headfirst into a gang like the Black Vultures would be suicide. And then, a thought struck him. There was one man who might be able to help. A man from Eve's past. Samuel rode hard through the night, pushing his horse to its limits until he reached the outskirts of a remote town. There, in a run-down shack on the edge of the Badlands, lived Jedediah Kane. Kane was once one of the most feared bounty hunters in the West, but age had slowed him down. He sat in the dim glow of a lantern, sipping whiskey, his weathered face unreadable as Samuel burst in. They took Eve. The Black Vultures. Jedediah slowly set his glass down. His expression hardened. "Damn fools," he muttered. "They have no idea what they've just done." Samuel's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Jedediah met his gaze, eyes filled with something close to amusement. "You don't know, do you?" he said with a low chuckle. "Samuel, your wife ain't just a rancher. She's a legend. And I guarantee you, she ain't sittin' around waitin' to be rescued." The Black Vulture's hideout was a ramshackle collection of cabins and tents nestled deep in the canyonlands. The fire crackled as the gang celebrated their latest haul, laughing and boasting, convinced they had just secured an easy victory. Eve sat in the corner of a dimly lit cabin, her hands bound, but her mind sharp as ever. She listened. She watched. Jeb Crowley leaned against the table, grinning as he addressed his men. "We send a message to Callahan," he said. "Tell him if he don't hand over his land, we put a bullet in his wife." The men roared in approval, already imagining the payday. She counted numbers, noted who was loyal and who seemed nervous. She watched how they carried their weapons, who was quick, who was sloppy. Most importantly, she listened for cracks in their unity. A gang that didn't trust each other was a gang that could be broken from the inside. She leaned back, a small smile ghosting her lips. Let them think they had her. They would soon learn the truth. The celebration carried on, but not everyone was at ease. A young outlaw, no older than 20, sat by the fire, staring at Eve with unease. His hands shook as he pulled a crumpled bounty poster from his saddlebag, smoothing it out with trembling fingers. The face on the poster wasn't quite the same. The woman in the image was younger, fiercer, eyes darker, colder, but there was no mistaking it. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. He nudged his friend beside him. "Hey, you know who she is, don't you?" The other outlaw frowned. "What are you talking about?" The young man licked his lips, his face pale. "That's Eve Callahan, but they used to call her." Eve counted every gun, every knife, every set of wary eyes that watched her from across the camp. These men thought they had the upper hand, but they had already made their first mistake. They underestimated her. She took her time, memorizing their faces, their movements. Some outlaws carried themselves with confidence, men who had killed before and would kill again. Others were sloppier, their hands lingering too long on the butts of their pistols, their eyes darting nervously toward their leader for reassurance. Then there were the ones who stood apart, the ones who didn't quite fit. She watched for small tells, who hesitated when given orders, who looked uneasy when their comrades laughed a little too hard at the suffering of others. A gang was only as strong as its weakest link, and Eve had learned long ago that loyalty in the outlaw world was fragile at best. The fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows against the ragged tents and battered saddles. Someone passed around a bottle of whiskey, the burn of liquor making them bold, careless. Laughter rose, rowdy and cruel, but beneath the bravado, she could sense it, cracks in the foundation. She leaned back against the rough wooden post she'd been tied to, letting her shoulders relax, a small, almost imperceptible smile ghosting across her lips. Let them think they had her. Let them celebrate. It wouldn't last. The celebration carried on, but not everyone was at ease. Near the edge of the firelight, a young outlaw sat stiffly on an overturned crate, his fingers twitching as he reached into his saddlebag. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out a worn, crumpled piece of paper, unfolding it carefully, his breath hitching as he smoothed out the creases. It was a bounty poster. The ink was faded, the edges torn from being shoved into pockets and saddlebags over the years, but the face on it was still clear enough. A woman's face, sharp, intense, framed by dark waves of hair. The eyes in the image were colder, harder, a gaze that had stared down the worst men in the West without a hint of fear. She looked a little younger, but there was no mistaking it. He swallowed hard. A bead of sweat traced down the back of his neck as his eyes flicked toward the woman now sitting quietly near the fire. She looked calm, almost bored, her expression unreadable. But the more he stared, the more he realized that she wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. His stomach twisted. He nudged the man beside him, voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, you know who she is, don't you?" The other outlaw frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What are you talking about?" The young man hesitated, his throat dry. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. "That's Eve Callahan." He licked his lips, dread coiling in his gut. "But they used to call her the Black Widow." His friend stilled, his grip tightening around the whiskey bottle. Across the fire, Eve's green eyes flicked toward them, just for a second, just enough to let them know she had heard. The young outlaw's breath caught in his throat. They weren't the hunters tonight. They were the prey. The words sent a ripple of unease through the group. Jeb overheard and let out a sharp laugh. "That," he gestured at Eve, "that's just some ranch wife. I don't care what stories you heard." The young outlaw's hands trembled as he gripped the bounty poster. "No, boss. You don't understand. They say she took down entire gangs single-handedly, that she could shoot a man between the eyes from 100 yards. That," Jeb cut him off with a scowl. "Shut up. She's nothing." But doubt had already begun to spread. Eve simply sat there, watching. The seeds had been planted. Samuel and Jedediah rode hard, tracking the Black Vultures across the unforgiving landscape. But no matter how skilled Jedediah was, the tracks would only last so long. That's when they met Chayton. Chayton was a native tracker who had once ridden alongside Eve in her bounty hunting days. Tall and lean, with piercing eyes that missed nothing. He had his own reasons for hating men like the Black Vultures. When Samuel explained the situation, Chayton only nodded. "Eve saved my life once," he said simply. "I owe her a debt. We ride at dawn." With Chayton's tracking skills and Jedediah's experience, they had a chance. But Samuel knew. Time was running out. As the days passed, Eve began her work. She played her captors against each other, planting whispers of doubt. She made small, subtle comments. "Did you see the way Jeb looked at your cut of the loot? Strange how he always gets the best horse, isn't it?" It didn't take long before tensions rose. Fights broke out. Trust crumbled. And in the dead of night, as the men argued amongst themselves, Eve quietly worked on freeing her hands from the ropes. She was almost there. Just a little longer. And when the moment came, she would remind them all why she had been feared. The night was thick with tension. The Black Vultures were too busy bickering amongst themselves to notice Eve's subtle movements. The ropes that had bound her wrists were now loose, her fingers curling around the hidden knife she had slipped from an oblivious guard. She waited. Timing was everything. One outlaw turned his back. Her moment arrived. With a single, swift motion, she lunged, clamping a hand over the man's mouth as she slit his throat, lowering his body soundlessly to the ground. Then, she took his gun. A slow smile spread across her face. It was time. She took out 2 more men with precise, silent shots before stepping out into the open, her silhouette backlit by the fire. The gang, mid-argument, turned in shock. Eve cocked the revolver and smirked. "You boys just made the worst mistake of your lives." For the first time, true panic settled into the outlaws. One man reached for his gun. Too slow. Eve fired, hitting him square between the eyes. The rest scrambled, cursing as they realized their prisoner was no longer helpless. She moved like a ghost, vanishing into the shadows between the cabins, picking them off one by one. A gunshot rang out. A scream followed. Then another. The legend of the Black Widow had just come alive. As the gunfire erupted from the hideout, Samuel, Jedediah, and Chayton were already in position. "That's our cue, boys," Jedediah muttered, cocking his rifle. They had used Chayton's tracking skills to circle the canyon, coming at the gang from the blind spot they never expected. Samuel's heart pounded. He wasn't a killer, but he would fight with everything he had to get Eve back. The 3 men attacked in unison. Gunfire cracking through the night, Eve fired, the shot echoing through the canyon, and the outlaw jerked backward, dead before he even hit the ground. For a split second, the camp fell into stunned silence. Then, chaos. "Hell! She's loose," one of the gang members hollered, scrambling for cover. Another turned just in time to see nothing but a shadow moving in the dark. A gunshot rang out. A scream followed. Then another. She moved like a ghost, slipping between cabins, using the flickering lanterns and the deep shadows to her advantage. The men spun wildly, firing into the darkness, but she was never where they expected. One by one, she hunted them. A blade flashed in the moonlight as she took down a man from behind. A strangled gasp, a gurgle, then silence. An outlaw near the campfire turned toward the sound, panic in his eyes. Too slow. Eve's gun came up. One shot, clean, precise. He dropped where he stood. The legend of the Black Widow had just come alive. As the first shots rang out from the hideout, Samuel, Jedediah, and Chayton were already in position. "That's our cue, boys," Jedediah muttered, cocking his rifle. They had used Chayton's tracking skills to circle the canyon, creeping in from the gang's blind spot. Samuel's heart pounded. He wasn't a killer, not like Eve had been, but he'd fight with everything he had to get her back. Jedediah raised his rifle, steady as ever. Chayton, silent as a ghost, notched an arrow and pulled it back. The three men attacked in unison. Gunfire cracked through the night. Jedediah's first shot took out the sentry on the ridge, sending him toppling over the ledge. Chayton's arrow whistled through the air and struck a man just as he was lifting his pistol. The outlaw stumbled, clawing at the shaft buried deep in his chest, before collapsing in the dirt. Samuel fired at a third, his hands shaking slightly, but his aim was true. The man cried out, staggering before he fell still. Panic spread through the remaining outlaws. "They're everywhere," one of them screamed. Eve took the moment of confusion and struck again. She darted behind the cover of an overturned wagon, reloading her revolver with calm precision. An outlaw charged toward her, but Eve was faster, always faster. She spun low, kicking his legs out from under him. As he hit the ground, she fired. Point blank. Done. By now, the gang had lost all control. Men ran for their horses, for cover, for their lives. Samuel fired again, the shot grazing an outlaw who yelped before stumbling toward the tree-line. Jedediah let out a sharp laugh. "Look at 'em run. Ain't got no stomach for a real fight." Chayton, ever silent, was already lining up his next shot. One by one, the gang fell, and soon, only one remained. The leader. He stood near the fire, gun in hand, but he wasn't aiming. He was staring at Eve, breathing hard, his face pale. "Black Widow," he whispered. "You're real." Eve stepped forward, her gun raised, expression unreadable. The outlaw swallowed hard, eyes darting to the bodies littered around the camp. He knew. He was already dead. "Wait," he started. Eve didn't. One last shot. He hit the ground. And just like that, it was over. The outlaws were now caught between an unstoppable force inside and a relentless assault from outside. Some panicked, turning their weapons toward the attackers in the canyon, only to be gunned down by Jedediah's sharpshooting. Others tried to find cover, but Eve was already among them, a force of nature, finishing what she had started. Samuel pushed forward, ducking behind a wagon as bullets whizzed past him. He saw Eve, mid-fight, moving like a spectre through the chaos. Their eyes met across the battlefield. She gave him a small, knowing nod. She was alive. She was fighting. And together, they would finish this. Jeb Crowley watched the chaos unfold from the safety of his cabin. His gang, his empire, was crumbling, and at the center of it all was her, Eve Callahan. His face twisted in fury as he stormed out onto the porch, shotgun in hand. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the gunfire. The battlefield stilled for a moment. Eve stepped forward, calm and steady, her revolver hanging loosely in her grip. Jeb sneered. "I don't care what stories they tell. You're just a woman." Eve tilted her head. "That's so." He grinned, tossing his shotgun aside. "Let's settle this proper. One-on-one. Just you and me." The outlaws who remained backed away, forming a silent circle. Jeb rolled his shoulders, flexing his fingers. He was fast. He had killed plenty of men in duels. He thought he could win. Eve didn't move, didn't blink. The night held its breath. Jeb reached for his gun. Eve moved first. The crack of her revolver split the air. Jeb staggered, eyes wide, looking down at the bullet hole in his chest. His fingers twitched, trying to raise his gun, but Eve had already holstered hers. He fell to his knees. Blood spilled from his lips as he stared up at her. "Why you?" he gasped. Eve crouched beside him, her voice soft. "You should have listened to the stories." With a final breath, Jeb Crowley slumped over, dead. Silence. Jeb was dead. Their leader, the man who had commanded them through fear, was gone. The remaining outlaws looked at Eve, at the bodies of their fallen, at the chaos around them, and they broke. Some dropped their weapons on the spot, raising their hands in surrender. Others bolted into the night, desperate to escape. Eve let them go. They weren't a threat anymore. Her gaze landed on the young recruit, the one who had recognized her. He stood frozen, his pistol half raised, fear etched into his face. Eve walked up to him and, with a swift motion, knocked the gun from his hands. "Go home," she said, "and never pick up a gun again." He nodded, his face pale, before turning and running into the darkness. Eve exhaled slowly. It was over. Samuel rushed to her, gathering her into his arms. "You okay?" he murmured. Eve smiled tiredly. Never better. Behind them, the hideout still smoldered, the Black Vultures reduced to nothing more than a bad memory. And as dawn broke over the canyon, Samuel and Eve rode home, together. The morning sun painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson as Eve, Samuel, Jedediah, and Chayton rode back toward the ranch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush, but there was something else in the wind, peace. For the first time in years, Eve felt free. She glanced over at Samuel, who was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Guess we don't have to worry about the Black Vultures anymore," he finally said, chuckling. Eve smirked. "Nope. Not unless the dead start riding again." He reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I always knew there was more to you than you let on." She arched a brow. "Oh, and what gave it away?" He shrugged, a playful glint in his eyes. "The way you always knew exactly how many bullets were left in a gun. The way you could read a man just by looking at him." His smile softened. "And the way you never, ever looked afraid." Eve held his gaze for a long moment before she turned forward again, her grip tightening on the reins. She had spent so long running from her past. But now, she wasn't sure she had to anymore. As the ranch came into view, Jedediah slowed his horse, pulling back on the reins. "Well," he said, exhaling, "this is where I take my leave." Samuel frowned. "You sure you don't want to stay a while? We owe you a debt." Jedediah waved a dismissive hand. "Nah, you don't owe me a damn thing." He turned to Eve, his gaze sharp. "But you, if you ever get tired of this quiet life, there's always work for you. Bounty hunting ain't the same without a Callahan on the trail." Eve smirked. "I'll keep that in mind." With a final tip of his hat, Jedediah turned his horse and rode off, whistling a tune that faded into the distance. Chayton, who had been silent as ever, nodded to Eve. "The spirits are at peace," he said simply. "And so are you." Eve swallowed, surprised by how much those words settled something deep inside her. "Thank you," she murmured. He gave a slight bow before nudging his horse forward, disappearing into the horizon. And then, it was just Eve and Samuel. Eve held his gaze for a long moment before she turned forward again, her grip tightening on the reins. She had spent so long running from her past. But now, she wasn't sure she had to anymore. The dirt road stretched before them, winding through the open plains, leading back to the life she had built, the life she had chosen. As the ranch came into view, golden light spilling over the fields, the faint outline of their barn standing tall against the morning sky, Jedediah pulled back on his reins, slowing his horse to a stop. "Well," he said, exhaling, "this is where I take my leave." Samuel frowned. "You sure you don't want to stay a while? We owe you a debt." Jedediah waved a dismissive hand, a half-smirk playing on his lips. "Nah, you don't owe me a damn thing." He turned to Eve, his gaze sharp with something almost like admiration. "But you, if you ever get tired of this quiet life, there's always work for you. Bounty hunting ain't the same without a Callahan on the trail." Eve smirked. "I'll keep that in mind." There was no need for more words. They had fought together, bled together, and sometimes that meant more than any goodbye ever could. With a final tip of his hat, Jedediah turned his horse and rode off, whistling a tune that faded into the distance. Chayton, who had been silent as ever, watched the horizon for a moment before turning to Eve. "The spirits are at peace," he said simply. "And so are you." Eve swallowed, surprised by how much those words settled something deep inside her. For so long, she had carried the weight of her past, every life she had taken, every ghost that had haunted her nights. But for the first time, she felt light. Not because she had forgotten, but because she had finally made peace with the woman she had been and the woman she had become. "Thank you," she murmured. Chayton gave a slight bow before nudging his horse forward, disappearing into the horizon with the quiet grace of a man who had always been more spirit than flesh. And then, it was just Eve and Samuel. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the tall grass that surrounded their land. Home. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Samuel reached over, taking her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Reckon we should fix up the barn first," he mused, his voice warm with that same steady calm that had always been her anchor. "Or maybe the fence." Eve huffed a soft laugh. A normal life. Repairs, chores, rebuilding. It was so simple compared to the life she had once lived, yet it was everything she had ever wanted. "Guess we've got work to do," she said, nudging her horse forward. Samuel followed, and together, they rode toward the ranch, their ranch. The past would always be there, lingering like a shadow at her back. But for the first time, Eve wasn't running from it. She was riding forward. As they entered the ranch, Samuel dismounted, walking over to help Eve down. She didn't need the help, of course, but she let him take her hand anyway. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. "I always knew," he said finally. Eve tilted her head. "Knew what?" "That you were more than just a simple rancher's wife." His voice was soft, steady. "That there were ghosts in your past. That you had secrets you weren't ready to share." She felt something tighten in her chest. "And you never asked." Samuel smiled. I figured when you were ready, you'd tell me." Eve exhaled, looking out at their land, at the rolling fields and the barn bathed in the golden light of dawn. This was the life she had chosen, the life she had fought for. She turned back to him. "No matter my past, Samuel, I choose you. I choose this." His hand found hers again, rough and warm, grounding her. "Then that's all I'll ever need." And with that, they stepped forward together, toward the future they had fought so hard to protect. The tale of the Black Widow's return spread faster than wildfire across the frontier. In every dusty saloon and every back alley, hushed whispers carried the name of Eve Callahan, the woman who had wiped out an entire gang and walked away without a scratch. Samuel's voice was steady, filled with quiet understanding. That you were more than just a simple rancher's wife. That there were ghosts in your past. That you had secrets you weren't ready to share. Eve felt something tighten in her chest. How long had he known? Had she been fooling herself all these years, thinking she had hidden her past from him? "And you never asked," she murmured, her voice softer than she intended. Samuel smiled, that familiar, easy, unwavering smile. "I figured when you were ready, you'd tell me." She exhaled slowly, turning her gaze to the land stretched out before them. Their land. The rolling fields, the worn wooden fence, the barn bathed in the golden glow of the rising sun. This was home. This was the life she had built with him. She had killed for it, fought for it, nearly died for it. Eve turned back to him, her sharp green eyes softer than before. "No matter my past, Samuel, I choose you. I choose this." His hand found hers, calloused and warm, grounding her in a way nothing else ever could. "Then that's all I'll ever need." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. The weight of everything, what had been, what could have been, what almost was, settled between them like dust after a storm. Then, together, they stepped forward, toward the future they had fought so hard to protect. The tale of the Black Widow's return spread faster than wildfire across the frontier. In every dusty saloon, in every back alley, in every shadowed corner where outlaws and drifters gathered, hushed whispers carried the name Eve Callahan, the woman who had wiped out an entire gang and walked away without a scratch. Some said she was a ghost, a nightmare from the past that had come back to haunt the wicked. Others swore she was just a myth, an exaggerated legend meant to scare men into keeping their hands off the wrong woman. But the ones who knew better, the ones who had seen the carnage firsthand, who had heard the last screams of the Black Vultures as they fell one by one, they knew the truth. And if a man had any sense, he'd pray he never gave her a reason to come looking for him. Far away from the rumors, far from the fear, Eve and Samuel rebuilt their life. The ranch needed repairs. The barn still bore the scars of gunfire. The land needed tending. The fences needed mending. But they were still standing. They worked side by side, as they always had, as they always would. Some things had changed, but at their core, they were still just Evelyn and Samuel Callahan, a wife and a husband, a woman and a man, a warrior and the man who loved her. Still, on certain nights, when the wind howled through the hills, Samuel would catch Eve sitting on the porch, her rifle resting across her lap, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon, waiting, watching, because no matter how many outlaws ran scared, no matter how many men whispered her name in fear, there would always be another threat, Another storm waiting to roll in. Samuel would stand in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. He never told her to come inside. He never had to. She'd glance at him over her shoulder, that same quiet, knowing smile touching her lips. She wasn't waiting for trouble. She was just making sure trouble knew better than to come knocking. Some said she was a ghost, a myth reborn. Others swore she had struck a deal with the devil himself. The outlaws who had once ruled the land with iron fists. They were terrified. More than a few packed up and left town overnight, unwilling to risk crossing paths with her. Others stayed but never let their backs face an open doorway. And Jeb Crowley's name? It became a cautionary tale. "You hear what happened to Jeb?" a grizzled outlaw muttered over his whiskey. "Thought he could tame a rattlesnake. Turns out, the rattlesnake bit first." And so, the legend of the Black Widow lived on. Back at the ranch, life carried on. The land needed tending. The fences needed mending. The cattle still needed to be driven. To the outside world, Eve and Samuel were just another married couple trying to carve out a life in the untamed West. But the past has a way of leaving scars. Even after rebuilding what was lost, Eve could feel it in her bones. Trouble never truly stays away. And so, every evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky bled into shades of orange and violet, she would sit on the porch, her rifle resting against the wooden railing, watching, waiting, because in a world like this, peace was never promised, and if the past ever came knocking again, the Black Widow would be ready.